Since 2009, the federal minimum wage has remained stagnant at $7.25 an hour. As a result, we're seeing more states getting involved to boost the pay for their lowest earners. 29 states and the District of Columbia now have a minimum wage higher than the federal minimum. Democrats have tried to lead a push in Indiana, but can't get past the Republican supermajority. They're trying again this session, but as Sarah Whitmire reports, the outcome seems unlikely to be any different from the past.
Pretty cool day. Did you do any work today?
These are the moments Shanika Jakes lives for, seeing her son happy and talking about his day at school.
I don't like disappointing my kids.
Jakes has 4 kids, but only her son is living with her right now.
He's wanting to be around his sisters. This is all that he says. And it's like now it's kind of getting tough because he's acting out. He's not wanting to listen. It's just like I want my sister and I want what I want. And it's getting difficult.
Make no mistake about it. Being with her children is what Jakes wants too.
I can only maintain just one right now on the income that I'm on.
It's like sometimes it's your turn, sometimes it's not.
Jakes makes minimum wage, $7.25 an hour, working part-time at an Arby's not far from here. Her paycheck can usually cover 1, maybe 1.5 of her bills.
After a while, it's like when you're paying partial, it just puts you back further and further and further. It makes the balance higher.
Her situation right now is pretty dire. Jakes doesn't have heat, so she's using her oven to keep herself and her son warm. She recently moved into this house on Indianapolis's northeast side, and she's already behind on the rent.
Right now, my rent hasn't even been paid for January because of my check and how he had me scheduled. I didn't have enough but $50 to give to my rent man.
At the State House, some legislators are pushing for a session dedicated to folks like Jakes, working-class Hoosiers who are struggling to make ends meet. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, about 108,000 Hoosiers earned the minimum wage or less in 2013. Democrats want to make it so no one who works a 40-hour work week falls below the poverty line. They have 2 proposals. Each would raise the state's minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. One would do it in increments, and the other would do it in one fell swoop.
It's part of the national movement, obviously, but I do think that it faces a tough battle here in Indiana.
29 states and Washington, D.C. have a minimum wage higher than the federal level, and that number is growing.
I think if Indiana raises the minimum wage, it will be because the federal government says it has to.
Governor Mike Pence laid out his priorities this week during his annual State of the State address.
Hoosiers are going back to work.
Democratic leader Scott Pelath says the speech was telling for what wasn't in it.
There's still people that are struggling out there. They're happy gas prices are down. That's the first good news they've had in a while. Didn't have anything to do with Mike Pence. They're happy that there's a national economic recovery and that the national economy is growing. Didn't have anything to do with Mike Pence, but they're also struggling in terms of their household income. That's not getting better.
Arguments for and against raising the minimum wage can both be backed up with research. Proponents of a wage hike maintain if you put more money into the hands of low-wage earners, there will be more money flowing through the economy, and everyone will win. Opponents say businesses, particularly those in service industries, will feel a huge hit and be forced to cut workers. The Congressional Budget Office estimates 500,000 people could lose their jobs if the federal minimum wage goes up to $10.10.
So where are those 500,000 jobs going to go away? They're probably not going to go away in places like California, Washington, Oregon. These are states that most of the locales there have minimum wage laws that are higher than the federal minimum and are probably even higher than the 1010 mark. Those jobs aren't the ones that are going to go away. The ones that are going to go away are in places that are low cost, low wage states like Tennessee, Indiana.
That gets to the idea of a free market and the idea that if the market demands additional wages, pay will go up. That's the tone Indiana's Republican supermajority has taken when similar proposals have been introduced in previous years. They also point out that while Indiana ranks among the worst in the nation in per capita income, the cost of living is also low. Back at her house, Jakes says meeting her basic needs are still difficult.
I would just say to the legislators that just put yourself in our shoes, not being able to cover, you know, the rent or cover a light bill and go without gas and it's winter and it's cold. Like, I just think they should just put aside, like, come down off the high horse that they're sitting on and just come into our lifestyle for a day or two and just see what we have to struggle with and go through. And then maybe their vision on it would be different.
The profile of a minimum wage worker is a point of contention. It's an often heard argument that raising the minimum wage would likely benefit young people who are only working these jobs part-time and temporarily until they get older and move into other types of work. The data shows those who are trying to hold a family together on a minimum wage salary, like Shanika, are a small subsection of those making the minimum wage. However, most of the workers who earn minimum wage are adults. Shanika is working on her diploma and hopes she'll be able to get a better paying job. We'll continue to follow the minimum wage proposals this session if either gets a hearing. The chair of Senate Labor Committee has said, however, that he doesn't plan to act on the issue.